Hey folks, welcome to video number 13, this one on American expansion and imperialism. This was a time period when the United States was going to expand its physical borders and its influence economically, politically, and socially all across the world. So let's get started. So first of all, the United States was not alone in this global expansion. By the late 1800s, several European countries and Japan had established colonies in Africa and Asia, countries like Great Britain, Germany, Belgium, and France, as well as Italy. And this is something known as imperialism. It's a policy where stronger nations extend economic, political, and military control over weaker nations. So with the United States, by 1890, the idea of manifest destiny was fulfilled. This idea that the United States was destined or was definitely going to stretch continuously from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. The United States had achieved that by 1890. So now the United States turned its sights on extending its power and influence beyond its physical borders. So here's an example of how imperialism affected Africa. Notice how all those African countries are divided up between the French, which is in blue, the British, which is in green, Belgium, which is that bright orange spot in the middle, in the Belgian Congo. Yellow is Italy, the orange was controlled by Spain. So you notice there were very few countries that remained independent. Ethiopia was the longest lasting independent, non-colonized, but even Italy finally succeeded in colonizing it at one point. Then you look at the United States in 1890. The United States went from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and back. The United States controlled all of that land in between. So why? Why did the United States want to get involved in this? Well, first of all, it would require them to improve their military strength. There's an admiral named Alfred T. Mann who advocated for the United States building up its navy in order to keep up with European countries and also keep up with Japan. Also, taking over other countries, smaller countries, would develop a new market for goods. The United States was producing more and more goods, and they needed new markets and customers to sell these goods to. They also could use the resources in these other countries to produce even more goods. There was also a belief in cultural superiority among many Americans. The idea of social Darwinism, the idea that the residents of these other countries, of these weaker territories, were inferior to Americans, particularly white Americans. This was a widespread idea amongst many white Americans. And they felt that they had a responsibility or a right as a superior culture, this Anglo-Saxon Christian culture, to civilize the people in these other countries. So check out these political cartoons. For instance, you see Uncle Sam representing the United States carrying all these people from other countries. And notice how the way that those people from the other countries are portrayed, almost like animals and savages, not as real people. Here's a cartoon that kind of hits close to home here, a school teacher in an unruly classroom. And you notice that the children in this classroom, they're very exaggerated, but they represent these ill-mannered people in these other countries. So let's take a look at the United States and how we became this global power. So in 1867, the Alaska Territory was purchased from Russia by then Secretary of State William Seward. Initially it was called Seward's Folly because nobody thought there was anything up there except for ice and polar bears. But gold was soon discovered and followed by oil, timber, and other valuable resources. And so a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, but a good number of people headed up there and were glad that Alaska was part of the United States. In fact, it became the 49th state in 1959. Same year, the United States claimed the Midway Islands in the Pacific Ocean. They were midway, so-called midway point between the United States and Asia. Then Hawaii in the 1890s, well, it actually used to be a kingdom, an independent kingdom, but you had United States businesses and missionaries that had been on the islands since the early 1800s. They could do a lot of business in fruit and in sugar. And these U.S. businesses and the military gradually increased their control over local voting and control of the government. And eventually a U.S. Navy base was built at Pearl Harbor. Well, these businesses weren't happy with some of the decisions that were made by one of their queens, Queen Liliuokalani. Let's say that again, Queen Liliuokalani. when she moved to increase voting rights of Native Hawaiians. And so they overthrew the Queen and established their own independent country, and eventually was annexed by the United States in 1898, and then became the 50th state in 1959, the very same year that Alaska became a state in the United States. So here you go. Here's a map to give you an idea about how big Alaska actually is compared to the United States. Alaska is about the size of half of the bottom 48 states. Alaska is massive. Here's a picture of Queen Liliuokalani, the queen who was overthrown in Hawaii by those U.S. businesses. Now check out this cartoon that portrays Queen Liliuokalani. And notice how she's portrayed in the cartoon compared to how she actually was in real life. All right, let's take a look at Cuba now. The United States had long been interested in Cuba since it's only 90 miles south of Florida, so close to the United States. Lot of natural resources with sugar, and they had several revolutions attempted by the Cubans against the Spanish government that actually controlled Cuba. And one of the most noted revolutionaries was Jose Marti. He was a Cuban poet and he was a journalist who helped lead the revolution that would ultimately be successful and began it in 1895. He called for what's known as Cuba Libre, which means free Cuba. Now, the Spanish did not do themselves any favors in this revolution by using harsh tactics to put down the revolt. And this grabbed a lot of attention from outside of Cuba, particularly from the United States. And this led to something known as yellow journalism. So newspapers of the day would exaggerate details and focus on sensationalizing a story rather than on making sure the story is accurate. They did this because they could sell more copies of their paper if they exaggerated details and had attention-grabbing headlines and pictures. Two of the papers that were the biggest proponents of yellow journalism, the New York Post and the New York World. They competed to outdo and outsell each other. And it helped them when a letter called the Delome letter, which was a letter from the Spanish ambassador that they got their hands on, mocked President McKinley, who was president at the time. And it was leaked and published by the New York Journal. And this outraged Americans. Americans were angry about this, that the Spanish ambassador would dare mock McKinley. And they called for a strong action, a strong response to this. So partly because of this and partly because of a wanting to protect American interests in Cuba, the USS Maine, a battleship, was sent to the Havana harbor just to hang out in the harbor and just kind of remind the Spanish government that America will intervene if they think there's a threat to their interests. So here's some of the images, for instance, you would have seen in the newspapers. Notice these shocking images that would have convinced people to buy the paper to find out more. And this image, the story that went out where the Spaniards were searching women on American ships and stripping the women down. The thought of men stripping down a woman to search for illicit goods shocked Americans and made them want to buy papers and find out more and talk about what was going on in Cuba. And this eventually is going to lead to the Spanish-American War in 1898. So on February 15th in 1898, the USS Maine, which had been sent down to Havana Harbor, actually blew up in the harbor mysteriously. Over 260 American sailors were killed and hundreds more injured. Now the newspapers claimed that it was blown up by the Spanish, that they had used a mine or done some other thing to blow up the ship. And newspapers and others were crying, "Remember the Maine," particularly those who wanted to retaliate and get their revenge against Spain. And later studies have shown that it probably was that the explosion on the ship was internal and was not external. So the ship blew up because, well, they just made some mistakes. However, we didn't know that until much, much later. We couldn't confirm that until much, much later. So on April 20th, the United States declared war against Spain. By May, the U.S. had destroyed the Spanish Navy in the Philippines, which was a Spanish territory in the Pacific, and American forces there worked with Filipino rebels to defeat the Spanish forces. From June to July, the United States invaded Cuba and defeated the Spanish forces. The United States also invaded Puerto Rico and took it over very easily, along with Guam. In fact, this war was over so quickly, the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, called it a splendid little war. Here's an artist's rendering of the explosion of the USS Maine. Here's one of the headlines from the New York Journal, one of those papers that promoted yellow journalism. Notice the headline: Congress declares war. It's big, it's bold, it's promising all this information. And here's another one from the New York Journal. Notice how the headlines are big and bold and attention grabbing. You don't even have to read the article to know that it's got something exciting. The peace treaty is ratified. Awful slaughter are getting your attention. So the Treaty of Paris, which was signed to end the Spanish-American War, in it, Spain agreed to free Cuba. They gave Guam in the Pacific and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to the United States, and they sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. But people and government officials argued against annexing the Philippines. They didn't think this was right for the United States to take over the Philippines. They thought the Philippines should be an independent country or stay with Spain. And the people who criticized this taking over the Philippines created a league, a group called the Anti-Imperialist League. They opposed this expansion of U.S. power over other countries. Members of this group were kind of a random bunch. They included former presidents, authors like Mark Twain, business tycoons like Andrew Carnegie, and social activists like Jane Addams, people who otherwise didn't really agree on much. But the pro-annexation argument won, and the Treaty of Paris was ratified in early 1899, and the U.S. officially now had an empire. Here's a cartoon where you have on the right a caricature of President William McKinley demonstrating the different islands that the United States now controlled in the Pacific and Caribbean, with Uncle Sam looking at this menu and saying, well, I hardly know which to take first. Here's another one. Which is critical of the United States taking over the Philippines, with McKinley looking at the map, but then Justice is pulling back the curtain and showing that the United States says they're going to civilize the Philippines, and yet they can't even civilize their own country. It's mocking the United States for not doing anything about lynching, which was happening in the southern United States. So what about the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans? Well, both islands were occupied by the U.S. military following the war. And the Foraker Act in 1900 established a civil government in Puerto Rico. And then you had some Supreme Court cases called the insular cases. Insular is a word that refers to islands. These cases ruled that the Constitution does not automatically apply to residents of U.S. territories. Still, Congress did extend citizenship and voting rights to Puerto Ricans in 1917. Cuba was recognized by the United States as an independent country because of something known as the Teller Amendment that the United States added before they invaded Cuba. However, Cuba's constitution had to include something known as the Platt Amendment. And this amendment that was forced upon them by the United States restricted Cuba's ability to make treaties with other countries. It also said that the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba whenever the United States thought it necessary. Cuba could also not go into debt with other countries. And the United States could rent land from Cuba for naval stations. And in fact, we still have a naval station in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, or you may have heard it called Gitmo. There's a prison there on the military base where we actually keep prisoners who've been accused of terrorism against the United States. So turning back to the Philippines, remember the Philippines could have been an independent country, but the United States decided to annex that. Well, rebels under a man named Emiliano Aguinaldo, who was expecting to be the first president of the Philippines, was angered that the United States did not recognize the independence of the Philippines. And so he led a revolt that started in early 1899. And this revolt lasted for 3 years. It was a brutal war, resulting in at least, if not over, 20,000 Filipino deaths and 4,000 American deaths. And this affected not just soldiers, but also civilians. The civilians in the Philippines were forced into internment camps where they lacked food, shelter, water, and medicine. Disease was able to spread very quickly in these internment camps. Over time, the United States gradually extended more rights and power to the Filipinos in their government, and eventually independence of the Philippines was recognized on July 4th, 1956. That's a long time. That's almost 50 years where the Philippines were kept by the United States. Here's a picture of Emiliano Aguinaldo, and here's a picture of some of the death and devastation that was a result of this war between the Filipinos and the United States. Now we're going to take a look at China. The United States had seen the Philippines as a gateway to China and the rest of Asia because the Philippines are so close to China and Japan. Many European powers had already established military and business settlements in China during this time, and the Chinese government couldn't really resist this. They were too weak to resist. In fact, they were so weak, they were nicknamed the sick man of Asia. The United States wanted in on the action, and so the Secretary of State, John Hay, the same Secretary of State who had called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war, and hey, here's a little interesting fact, he used to be the secretary for President Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, John Hay, who's now the Secretary of State, advocates for something known as the open door policy, and he shared it with these other European imperialist countries and Japan. He argued that nations should share trading rights in China with the United States, and that no one country should have a monopoly over trade and resources in the United States. So again, the Chinese government was too weak to really resist this, but there were Chinese citizens who were angry about these actions by these European countries, and they resisted. One group, known as the Boxers, led a rebellion in 1900, and they fought back against the imperialists. It was eventually put down by a combination European and U.S. military force, and the United States continued to expand their economic and military control over the region. Now, to give you an idea about the spheres of influence, the areas, the ports and other areas that were controlled by European countries, you can look at this map and see where it was the Japanese, the British, the French, and the Russians were involved, kind of just splitting up China and its resources and people. And here's a cartoon that is talking about the open door policy. Notice Uncle Sam holding that giant key, staying in front of the open door that leads to China. And outside are all these figures that represent different European powers, as well as one representing Japan. So, going on into the early 1900s, you've got presidents who get involved in this imperialist movement. So Theodore Roosevelt comes to power, and his policy was known as the Big Stick policy. President Roosevelt loved the idea of the United States as a world power. Earlier, he had advocated for the expansion of the Navy, and he had even fought in Cuba with a group known as the Rough Riders. And his Big Stick policy was to use peaceful means to acquire power and influence, but use force if it is necessary and have force ready. Well, in 1905, Roosevelt negotiated a treaty to end the Russo-Japanese War, a war between Russia and Japan, and they signed something known as the Treaty of Portsmouth, named after Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and in fact, Roosevelt earned the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. And this leads to a dialogue between the United States and Japan over trade and control over the Pacific. Then TR oversaw the creation of the Panama Canal in 1904 by recognizing Panama's independence from Colombia. Panama used to be just a state, a province of Colombia, and they wanted to be an independent country. The United States said, cool with us. And once they did that, the United States was allowed to come in and build a canal across the isthmus that connected the Atlantic and Pacific and allowed for ships going between the Atlantic and Pacific to move more quickly instead of having to go all the way around South America. Roosevelt also issued something known as the Roosevelt Corollary. This was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, this doctrine that was passed by former President James Monroe, where he warned Europe to stay out of Latin America. Well, Teddy Roosevelt went a step further, and he asserted that the United States would use force to protect their economic interests in Latin America. And this continued under President Taft, who followed Roosevelt, where the United States would repeatedly send troops into places like Nicaragua and Cuba. But Taft also supported something known as dollar diplomacy, where the United States government would make loans, guaranteed loans made to foreign countries by American businesses to encourage American involvement and development in those countries. Here's a cartoon that shows President Roosevelt swinging his big stick around the world to protect Latin America from European countries. And here's a map that shows you how you could save time using the Panama Canal between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And then here is the construction of the Panama Canal happening. Notice how big those doors are that would have let ships through. And you can still see the Panama Canal today. There's a live stream of it that you can visit on the website. So following Roosevelt and Taft, you had a new president, Woodrow Wilson, and he used something known as missionary diplomacy. Wilson argued that the United States had a moral duty to not recognize any Latin American government that was oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to the United States. And one country that got a lot of attention was Mexico. In Mexico, there were millions of US dollars in land, oil, and railroads. But when Wilson became president, Mexico was in the midst of a violent revolution that had begun in 1910. And the United States would eventually intervene, sending in the military several times. And we almost went to war with Mexico over this. In fact, the United States soldiers sent General John J. Pershing after the rebel leader Pancho Villa, who had overseen some attacks across the United States and killed some Americans who were in Mexico. Villa's men had raided a small town in New Mexico, but Pershing was unable to actually capture Villa and withdrew. But Wilson asserted that the United States would intervene to protect its economic, social, and military interests in Latin America if compelled to do so. So here's a picture of Woodrow Wilson. Notice how stern he looks. He did smile on occasion, but he was a very, very serious man. And here's a cartoon showing him as a teacher, stern teacher, lecturing these countries that are represented by Mexico, Nicaragua, how they should be behaving. Well, thanks for watching. The next video, video 14, will be about the United States in World War I, so as we continue to establish our position as a global power.